robber baron was an American capitalist at the turn of the 19th century who enriched himself upon the sweat of others, exploited natural resources, or possessed unfair government influence. The term combines with the concept of a criminal robber with an illegitimate aristocrat baron. The term had originally been applied to bandits and minor nobility who had preyed upon the trade routes in the eastern areas of Europe during the Middle Ages. Robber barons were accused of eliminating competition through predatory pricing and then overcharging when they had a monopoly. During the Industrial Revolution, a captain of industry was a business leader whose means of amassing a personal fortune contributes positively to the country in some way. A captain of industry, at least as understood during the 19th century, was a powerful force in his chosen field of interest. In an era where business monopolies were rarely, if ever, regulated by the government, a man of means could use any number of business practices to gain substantial control over a key resource or manufacturing process. These practices were not always legal or ethical, but the results were usually favorable for the magnate and his family. Such industrialists and robber barons were often one and the same, depending on their interest or disinterest in the welfare of others. The industrialist J.P. Morgan of the late 19th century and early 20th century is best characterized as a captain of industry. He would be best characterized as this because he helped to save the government from financial collapse and he made money in the process. President Cleveland needed gold to back the U.S. currency, and so Morgan gave him gold in exchange for bonds that he later cashed in for a big profit. He could make failing companies into very profitable companies. So he was very hardworking in business. In 1893, Morgan helped the financial panic and helped the railroad industry recover. He merged railroad companies and became a stockholder in every one of them. He did the same thing with steel companies and made a fortune in both. He helped the government again in 1907 because his bank took government deposits. Morgan used his influence to help stabilize American financial markets during several economic crises, including the Panic of 1907. However, he faced criticism that he had too much power and was accused of manipulating the nation's financial system for his own gain. One of the captains of industry of the 19th century, Andrew Carnegie, helped build the formidable American steel industry, a process that turned a poor young man into one of the richest entrepreneurs of his age. The Civil War fueled the iron industry, and by the time the war was over, Carnegie saw the potential in the field and resigned from the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was one of the many bold moves that would change Carnegie's life in industry and earn him his fortune. He then turned his attention to the Keystone Bridge Company, which worked to replace wooden bridges with stronger iron ones. In 3 years, he had an annual income of $50,000. Carnegie was unusual among the industrial captains of his day because he preached for the rights of laborers to unionize and to protect their jobs. However, Carnegie's actions did not always match his rhetoric. Carnegie's steel workers were often pushed to long hours and low wages. In the Homestead Strike of 1892, Carnegie threw his support behind plant manager Henry Frick, who locked out workers and hired Pinkerton thugs to intimidate strikers. Many were killed in the conflict, and it was an episode that would forever hurt Carnegie's reputation and haunt the man. Still, Carnegie's steel industry was unstoppable. By 1900, Carnegie's steel produced more of the metal than all of Great Britain. With New York City experiencing a commercial boom, Vanderbilt's business prospered, even more so during the War of 1812 when the government awarded him a contract to provision forts in and around New York Harbor. He soon owned a fleet of schooners and personally commanded the largest one. His exploits won him a reputation for toughness and bravery. That same year, Vanderbilt convinced Gibbons to build a large steamboat. He moved to New York City, began a steamboat trade along the Hudson, and bested his competitors by cutting rates, often igniting prolonged rate wars. In 1834, he drove Daniel Drew from business and then entered the Albany trade. Soon, in an audacious argument, his competitors paid him handsomely to suspend his Albany route for 10 years. Instead, Vanderbilt steamboats plied different waters and sailed to Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, Massachusetts. He kept improving the steamboats, making them faster and more comfortable for passengers. By the mid-1840s, he had earned $1 million, and the public had taken to calling him Commodore Vanderbilt. The exclusive high society of New York City, however, continued to view Vanderbilt as a loud and boorish upstart and maintained its cold shoulder toward the entire Vanderbilt family. John D. Rockefeller was America's first billionaire. In a pure sense, the goal of any capitalist is to make money, and John D. Rockefeller could serve as the poster child for capitalism. Overcoming humble beginnings, Rockefeller had the vision and the drive to become the richest person in America. At the turn of the century, when the average worker earned $8 to $10 per week, Rockefeller was worth millions. Young John Rockefeller entered the workforce on the bottom rung of the ladder as a clerk in Cleveland's shipping firm. Always thrifty, he saved enough money to start his own business in produce sales. When the Civil War came, the demand for his good increased dramatically, and Rockefeller found himself amassing a small fortune. He took advantage of the loophole in the Union draft law by purchasing a substitute to avoid military service. When Edwin Drake discovered oil in 1859 in Tutsville, Pennsylvania, Rockefeller saw the future. He slowly sold off his interests and became convinced that refining oil would bring him great wealth. Rockefeller introduced techniques that totally reshaped the oil industry. John D. Rockefeller was the owner of the Standard Oil Company, which was the very first business trust in the U.S. and dominated the oil industry. He became extremely rich from his monopolistic ways that he is often thought of as the richest man in history. His wealth made others dislike him because he had so much power and the world was in his hand. He was also infamous for taking down any small business in his way just so he could always be number one. He was often called ruthless and controlling because of his actions against other businesses. Robber barons and captains of industry impacted society and the economy during the industrial period. Some historians argue that the robber barons and captains of industry were essential to the transformation of the United States into a world power, due to their significant investments in industry, infrastructure, and education. Because of these men, important social and economic inventions and improvements in railroads, steel, oil, automobiles, real estate, and finance were created.